Okay, I'm excited for this interview. Tonight, we have a fabulous special guest. His name is Bradley Harper, Dr. Bradley Harper, and he has an amazing story to tell of forensics, pathology, psychology, and many, many more subject matters. We also have with us our special co-host, William Brower. Hello, William.
Hello, and good evening, everybody. How's everyone doing tonight?
Good. Okay, so we would like to get started with Dr. Bradley Harper. How would you like me to address you throughout the interview?
Well, Jackie, my friends call me sir. Brad is perfectly fine, but thank you for asking.
Okay, for those of us who do not know who you are or what it is you do, regale us.
Okay, very good. Well, as Jackie said, I'm a retired U.S. Army pathologist. I did 37 years of active duty, first as an infantry guy, jumping out of airplanes, and one day I went in sick call, and the doctor I saw was such a jerk. I went home to my wife, says, that guy can make it through medical school. I think I can. So I did 4 years, got out, took some pre-med, got back in, went to the military medical school and came back in, and ultimately became a pathologist. I had 4 commands, 2 years in the Pentagon, 3.5 years with U.S. Army South, where I did a lot of trips to Central and South America. And I think it's in my bio, but at one point, when I was working with U.S. Special Forces in Colombia, the FARC had a award of $1.5 million for my capture. I just always want to make sure when I tell people that they understand the offer is no longer valid. Okay, so if you're planning on paying off your house and buying that big boat, I'm not the ticket for that. Yeah. So anyway, after retired, I was 62 years old, and I took about 15 months off, and then I said, I don't play golf. I don't have a boat. I don't fly. I'm a pretty boring guy, basically, and so I decided to take up writing, and one thing led to another. I had an idea for a story involving Arthur Conan Doyle, and the Hunt for Jack the Ripper, and after 3 years and 79 agents turned me down, number 80 said maybe, and she worked with me on it a little bit. It became a finalist for the Edgar Award in 2019, and it was a 2-book deal with the publisher. So the second book, the sequel, came out in 2020. The first book, A Knife in the Fog. The second book, poor choice of title for book 2, Queen's Gambit. That's been a pretty popular title for other people as well. So mine kind of got lost in the shuffle, but it was the book of the year, 2020 at Killer Nashville. Then I took off some time. I went to Scotland. About this time last year, I finished, almost completed a master's in creative writing at Napier University in Edinburgh, in Scotland. And then I came back and finished that up, and I'm refining that manuscript now, which takes place aboard the Titanic. And that's where William and I first made our connection. Was he's a huge aficionado in the Titanic and is a pillar of the Titanic community, and he's been very helpful in making sure I get my facts straight, because there's a lot of moving parts in that story. And let's see, I have a book coming out in September. It's a modern day police procedural, which I co-wrote with a young lady who lives in Japan and teaches English, and she's a family friend, so we work together on that. And let's see, that I have a couple short stories that have come out, and I've published some essays and some poetry, and I'm just kind of, at this point, I'm having a lot of fun. A Knife in the Fog. One of the nice things about going to the UK for most of a year was I made a lot of connections over there, and there's a movie director in London who's working with a Scottish screenwriter, and they're working on an adaptation of the first book. I got to pitch the concept about 2 months ago to a Hollywood producer. She loved the concept and said that she would love to be the first one to read the script when we think it's ready for prime time. So I'm hoping by the end of the summer, I'll get back on her schedule and pitch it to her. The director actually thinks we have a better shot with the BBC as a made for television movie, and whatever works is fine with me, but just a lot of fun. And I'm almost 72 years old. I say I don't have time to be timid. I'm having a lot of fun, and I guess I'll keep doing that as long as I can.
William, would you like to make comment on this wonderful man's sweatshirt from Full Sail?
I certainly would. Brad, I have to admit, your reputation precedes you on so many levels. Because when I got into Full Sail, I kid you not, literally every of the professors, and you and I have actually been very fortunate enough to have been taught by pretty much almost the same ones.
Yeah, excellent professors.
Without a doubt. And it was so hysterical. Your name became legendary and synonymous within the campus.
Really?
Oh, yeah, it was hysterical because so many of them were like, listen, you're a Titanic historian. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's just one aspect of it. I'm looking to broaden and expand my horizons. They're like, well, okay, but you write period pieces. There was a gentleman before you, Brad Harper. If you don't know the name, it's going to be synonymous with some major epic things in the near immediate future. You need to look for the name. And I was like, okay, let me write this down. Brad Harper. Okay. Go to the next class. Listen, you write in period pieces. Brad Harper. Okay, we already got that cleared.
This is the first I've heard of that. Well, wow, thank you. I'm going to have to get a larger hat.
So that's why I was very, very fortunate that we finally did, intercept and find each other through the Full Sail groups and everything else. So, and right off the bat, they definitely have never been so true. Because like I said, I was fortunate enough. I picked up a copy of A Knife in the Fog, and I literally just read it in one sitting. And,
wow.
Yeah. So I can't wait. I have BBC America, so I'll get some popcorn and the good old fashioned jelly babies off to the side. Just
right.
The release date.
Yeah, one of my favorite what if games is who would I like to play different characters in the story, and my favorite character, I think everyone's favorite character, is a woman named Margaret Harkness. And Jackie, I like to take real people and real situations and write a story that's so close to the actual events that someone who really knows the history says it could have happened like that. So there was a woman named Margaret Harkness. She was an author and a suffragette, and she was living in Whitechapel where the Jack the Ripper murders happened. And she was living there because she wrote about the working poor of London. So she wanted to live like the characters so she could, authentically portray them in her books. And so I have her connect with Conan Doyle and Professor Bell, who was the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes. The three of them bond together to help the Metropolitan Police catch Jack the Ripper. And so she's the strongest character in the story, I believe. And so I don't really have some ideas about the other characters, but Margaret Harkness, I want Emma Watkins to portray her because I think she would just knock it out of the park. She's the right age, the right body habitus. I mean, it would be just a marriage made in heaven. So I can dream.
Well, and I'll admit bias on this one, but I when I was reading Knife in the Fog initially the first time around, Jackie, I'm sure you can probably agree on this too. To agree, I pictured Belle being portrayed actually by my good friend and also in the Titanic community, Mark Allen Pilgrim.
Oh.
Okay.
Got enough of the mannerisms.
Because I've seen him. Yeah. We had him on the Titanic panel.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, beautiful individual, acting on point, and he is another one, a stickler for getting points right. So I'm going to move forward in the realm of Sherlock Holmes. It's a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. In sensibility, one begins to twist facts to suit the theory instead of theories to suit the facts. And in this point, because you Bradley are very much a stickler on getting things authentically right, even if it goes against your first ideas. Talk about that.
Okay. You know, the real facts are oftentimes more interesting than something I could think up. Also, putting constraints is a wonderful thing. Constraints help strengthen your imagination. If I say, write a story about anything, well, you don't know where to begin. But if I say, I want you to write about a left-handed blind man who walks who is walking on the deck of a sinking ship, that gives you already lots of things, images you can start working with. And so constraints are very good. And the world that I inhabit, first of all, I find a very interesting story, real events that are very interesting. And then, be constrained by those people, those events, that's not a problem at all. I'll tell you something about Bell. When I was writing in the book, I have him at one point do a handwriting analysis on the notes that were written or signed Jack the Ripper. After I put that in the story, about a year later, I found out that Bell actually did that.
Wow.
And I didn't know that at the time. I thought I made that up, and it's just like, boom, And then when I was on the second book, it's about a fictional assassination attempt on Queen Victoria. The anarchists are trying to kill her. They want to use a German man as the assassin because they want to precipitate a war between England and Germany to cause the fall of the ruling aristocracy throughout all of Europe. And so I said, I should probably get the name of the police commissioner because he would be responsible for the security along the parade route as Queen Victoria is going to St. Paul's Cathedral and then, of course, back to Buckingham Palace. So I got the guy's name and I just found out this guy's name was Bradley. He was a baronet. I don't know what a baronet is, but it sounds important. But the guy only had one arm. He lost his left arm to a tigress when he was an army officer serving in India. He was able to continue to serve and retire from the British Army. His last 4 years he was the aide-de-camp to Queen Victoria before he became the police commissioner of London. And this guy was so fascinating. I said, wow, I've got to put this guy in the story. The first story, Margaret Harkness, again, Doyle is kind of a middle-class guy, and I'm going to throw him into this unusual world of Whitechapel. It's the area that Charles Dickens called the abyss. This is where the poorest of the poor lived, and it was absolute squalor. So as a guide to this world, the magical world, if you go back to Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, so she was like the bridge, the mentor, the guide who helped get him into that new world. And I only intended for her to be in one or two scenes and then to fade away. But something happened is that whenever she was on the page, things just sparked. She just brought in something to the story that I couldn't quantify, but was very real to me, that she made the story, the dialogue, the tension she introduced, because she was angry at the role she was limited to in the patriarchy of that time. And it just really drove the story, made it much stronger. And so, again, someone I just stumbled upon that just raised the whole thing and ultimately became a full-fledged, and I think at the end of the day, the strongest character of the three. I had the three characters. I had Bell, Doyle, and Harkness. And after I wrote the book, I wish I could say I was smart enough to thought of this beforehand, but I realized after the fact that I had attributed each one of those three characters one aspect of the human personality. Now, Doyle was not egotistic, but, going back to Freud's definition, very much about the rules. The peas can't touch the carrots, that step on the back, on the crack, break your brother's back, sort of thing. He'd come up from a poor family. He was finally middle class, and his greatest aspiration was to be a typical, respectable middle class Englishman. I mean, he was all about looking respectable. Now, so rules were important. Bell understood the need for rules, but he also saw the larger picture. He was super ego.
Yeah.
So he was usually the adult in the room. And then Margaret, bless her heart, was pure id. She would usually say what she thought, usually as quickly as she thought it. And she's the kind of person we admire, but we can only keep up with them after we've had 2 or 3 stiff drinks at the bar. And so that interplay of those 3 distinct personality types created something that was greater than the sum of the other parts. And so stumbling on things, trying to work with the constraints of the real people, the real situation, fuels my imagination, fuels my creativity, and restraints, limitations on what you can do and can't do, I think makes for a better story.
Number 1, I got 2 points. Number
Sure.
1, you just sold a book. You made a sale. And so we're going to keep on the topic of A Knife in the Fog. Your debut, Knife in the Fog, follows Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and his friend Dr. Joseph Bell as they investigate Jack the Ripper. What inspired you to write this particular story, and how did you go about researching and portraying these historical figures? And then a caveat, what was going through your life as you were going through theirs?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Okay, I'd retired from the Army, as I said, and I was a huge fan of Sherlock Holmes. And one day I was reading Wikipedia. I support them, by the way. As much research as I do, I think it'd be immoral or unethical of me to use them as much as I do and not support them. So I was reading a brief little mini biography of Doyle, and he wrote the first Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet, wrote it in 1886, and he couldn't give that story away. Finally, after about 6 months of what he called a circular tour, the wife of one editor who was ready to reject it, she found it in the slush pile, went through it and said, this is kind of interesting. You ought to buy this. Well, the editor, just to kind of placate his wife, offered Doyle 25 pounds, which was an insult. Doyle wrote short stories for boys' magazines, and he would get 25 pounds for those. So, and A Study in Scarlet is a novella. So it was like 3.5, 4 times the length of an average short story. And so to be offered 25 pounds, and oh, by the way, he had to surrender full copyright, meaning he could never sell it again, never have it published anywhere else, was an insult. But he was just so tired of the thing by then, he said, okay, sold, take the 25 pounds. And he swore he would never write another crime story as long as he lived. 1886. 1887, it comes out finally in the Beaton's Christmas Annual. I think there's 5 copies known left to exist on in the world, and if you get one of those, you are set for life, I can tell you. Anyway, it does great, both critical and popular reviews. It sells out in about 4 weeks. Bill says, fine, I don't care. He loved historical fiction, so he's working on a novel about the English Civil War. 1890, he's persuaded to return to writing Sherlock Holmes. He is invited to dinner with this American magazine publisher, along with an Irish guy named Oscar Wilde. And the publisher at the end of the dinner says, I'll pay you each 100 pounds if you'll write something for my magazine. So Oscar Wilde writes The Picture of Dorian Gray, and Doyle returns to writing Sherlock Holmes. And I'd say that guy had a very successful dinner meeting. So 1888 is when Jack the Ripper does his thing, starts in August, ends early November, never knowingly caught. He may have done more than 5 women. We're not sure. We do know there are what they call the canonical 5. Don't know who he is, why he started, and why he stopped. And so I thought, so that was right in the middle of between when he wrote the first Holmes story and the second, The Sign of 4. And I just thought, wouldn't it be fun to write a story where I involve Conan Doyle in the hunt for Jack the Ripper that explains why the Ripper stopped without knowingly being caught, and why Doyle ultimately returned to writing Sherlock Holmes. So I just kind of combined those 2 ideas.
Do you think it could have been Doyle?
There we go. There's a new one.
well, as a matter of fact,
think it could have been Doyle?
As a matter of fact, some people have off the top of their head say, maybe it was Conan Doyle. Doyle had his own theory. Well, first of all, Doyle was over 6 feet tall. At this point,
I was too tall for
yeah, he would have
that.
stood out. Anywhere he went, he would have been noticed. The average Englishman at that time was 5'6", so he was a huge guy. You know, think of Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, the way he looms over people now. So Doyle would have had the same physical experience. Other people would have been intimidated and just would have remarked about how large he was, given the state of nutrition at that time. I went to the 1890 census of England, and just to give you an idea, if you lived in a village in England at that time in 1890, remember the Ripper was 1888, so 2 years later, average population density in a rural village in England was about 25 people per acre.
Yeah.
In London, in the West End, where the wealthy people lived, it was 50 people per acre. In Whitechapel, it was over 800 people per acre. Just the sheer population density, you know, that the Ripper is able to go about in this beehive of people, kill women in the streets, in the courtyards, and not be seen, not be caught, just boggles the mind. But what I'm getting to is a guy Doyle's size moving through all that humanity. People would have remarked upon that. They would have noticed him. So based on that alone, it
I
just
should have stuck with my first theory. My first theory is that it's a woman.
Funny you should say that. Doyle had his own theory. He thought that the Ripper was a man, but disguised as a midwife. That would explain why she would have a bloody knife and blood on the clothes. It'd be a man, but dressed as a woman,
Yes.
as a midwife, and the police would not have had a second thought about someone like that walking around the streets at night.
But not a woman either.
Right. Well, it's possible. It is, you know, the person was never caught. The killings became progressively more vicious, you know, as they went along. And I don't want to be sexist, but men tend to be more vicious, more violent when they commit these crimes than women are. But it is possible, since they were never caught. Who can say for sure?
Now, for something within that effect, especially with the later ones. Now this has always been my own theory on it. You know, just reading up on the notes on the cadavers and stuff like that. I've kind of hypothesized that 9 times out of 10, it seems almost similar to like a crime of passion. You know, just the areas and intentionally that the Ripper had focused on. So, you know, so I was never sure if that's something that could have been tied or something, or, you know, even a little bit of a Freudian slip along the way, or
yeah. Well, I do have a theory in the book. I have a person who, at the end, you know, you got to have the speech by the villain. I mean, that's a trope of that type of story, where they give their own rationale. But I'm not going to give that away here.
Oh.
No, please don't.
You write as if you have participated in the historical event, sightseeing one-on-one. You write as though you're participating in the actual event. To what do you attribute this style?
Well, as far as, you know, I've had Englishmen even say that they were surprised at how well I captured the voice of Arthur Conan Doyle, and they said they could. I made a couple of mistakes. I used a couple of terms. I say pants instead of trousers, and vest instead of waistcoat. So I had a couple of slip ups there that, you know, American usage as opposed to the other. But I think the way I got the voice, the intensity, was that the summer I turned 13, I read the entire Sherlock Holmes canon in 2 weeks. I just had this big book with everything Sherlock Holmes and just absorbed it. And so I think you know, my mind was still pliable at that age, and so the images that Doyle gives in that world of, you know, of the fog enshrouded city of London just kind of seeped into my DNA. And then, of course, I also visit the sites. I took a walk Whitechapel at night with the man Richard Jones. He's written 2 books about Jack the Ripper. He has a walking tour, and I bought out the tour. So that night it was just him. He usually has about 20 people. It was just him and myself for 3 hours walking Whitechapel at night. And Whitechapel was still a community of immigrants, and it's, although it's electric light now, it's still poorly lit. So you can imagine what it must have been like back in those days when it was still gaslight. And in fact, Queen Victoria, bless her heart, in 1890, when they started to electrify London, with electrical lights, she insisted that Whitechapel be the first area to get electric street lights to protect the people in that part of the city, because the crime rate was just so high. So yeah, I immersed myself in the area. I tried to imagine what was like. So I saw the sights, and of course, having a great guide was very useful to me as well. In fact, Richard told me one story on our walk that was not even in his book. When we went to the site where Mary Kelly was found, she was the 5th, and as far as we know, the final victim of Jack the Ripper. When her body was discovered, and as it was being prepared to be, brought out, it coincided with the installation of the Lord Mayor of London. The Lord Mayor of London, it's a 1-year term. It's more ceremonial than anything else, and they're kind of like the head of the Chamber of Commerce. But it's a ceremony that's steeped in tradition, and that was going on about 1.5 miles away. And so rumors spread to the crowd that another Ripper victim had been found, and it was only about 1.5 miles away. So thousands of people in their very formal dress left the ceremony and went over there to stand outside this building to see the body come out in the courtyard, go onto the police wagon, and be hauled off in a plain wooden box. And so news reports at the time say that there was absolute silence the entire time that this went on. So I wrote a scene. I portrayed that scene, and I contrasted it with the pomp and circumstance of the Lord Mayor's installation so very nearby. And I don't know if this was true or not, but I had the crowd could hear the sounds of the crowd at the installation, shouting, cheering, and the music, and contrasted the Lord Mayor in his ermine lined robes and his chain of office with this, woman being brought out in a dirty little wooden box with a rag on top. And so that contrast, I think, added to the pathos, and to contrasting the world of the people that lived in Whitechapel with the well-to-do who lived so very nearby.
Your latest book, Queen's Gambit, has received numerous awards. It involves a fictional assassination attempt on the Queen of Queen Victoria. What drew you to this particular era, and describe what it was like to write your first scene?
Okay. How that book came about, I was offered a 2-book deal with this publisher. And so my agent wrote me quickly. He says, the publisher who wants others, there were 5 publishers interested. And of those, one said, how about a 2-book deal? What is he working on now? And so my agent said, give me something quick. In 2 hours, he's leaving, and he's going to be gone for 2 weeks. So I had kind of started on this other book, and I came up with the thought I was going to take the book and the movie, The Day of the Jackal. But instead of Charles de Gaulle as the target, I was going to use Queen Victoria. And so the scene, the critical scene, is the moment when the assassin has Queen Victoria in their sights. And that, to me, is going to make or break the entire book. So that was the scene that I first started with. And again, I went to the site where Queen Victoria was. Because she was 78 years old, she had rheumatism. She said, I'm not getting out of the carriage. We're going to go to St. Paul's. They're going to bring the ceremony out to me. I'm going to sit in my carriage, and you can sing and do whatever, bless me, whatever you want to do. And then when that's done, we're going to head back to Buckingham Palace, and I'm having lunch. So for 20 minutes, she's absolutely motionless in this carriage. And I thought, if I'm an assassin, if I'm a sniper, that's the moment I'm going to choose. Because also for political effect, that would have the greatest impact, because it would be for thousands of people watching that happen. So I went to the site, and there's a little plaque that says, this is where her carriage sat during the ceremony. So am I answering your, I get on these tangents. Am I good?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So
Keep going.
so I stood there where the plaque was, and I looked around. Says, okay, where would I set myself up? Because as a former infantry guy, you have a pretty good idea. And so, first of all, there's a window looking right down on the site from the cathedral. I said, well, that's a good spot. But I say it's the stairwell. People go up and down. The sniper could it'd be hard for them to have enough time to do that without being caught. And then I looked, and there's a huge courtyard, and they had buildings with these big roofs. But looking at the photographs of the time of the ceremony, they put temporary bleachers on top of those buildings. So again, I like to stay close to the actual events. So I said, that's not a realistic place to have the sniper either. Then I looked at a side street, and there was a window on that corner of this building that was down the side street that looked right down where we were at. And so I said, if I was a sniper, that's where I would be. So my wife and I, we paced it, and the sniper has an air rifle, so it's powerful, but it doesn't have the same range as a regular rifle. But with an air rifle, you could fire during a crowd, and you wouldn't hear it. It would be drowned out by the sound of the crowd.
So loud.
Yeah, so we paced it off as 88 paces from that plaque to the wall beneath that window. So I said, oh, that would be very well within the range of this rifle. And knock on the front door, and it's a youth hostel now. But they told me in 1897 it was the boarding house for the boys' choir at St. Paul's. So that building would have been essentially empty. All the boys would have been on the steps of St. Paul's. And I said, bingo. So they let me in. We went up to that window, and my wife climbed up on the bunk that looks out, took some pictures. I went up on top of the building as well and looked around and took some pictures. And I just said, man, this is it. And so when I wrote that critical scene, that confrontation, when the forces of good and evil conflict, I was able to go into great detail in the scene because I envisioned the actual place. I had pictures of the actual place, and I also knew exactly the view they would have out that window. And someday I hope to get an email from somebody say, I stood at the site where that plaque is, and I saw that window.
So you have a varied background, military background, forensic pathology, psychology. So what I would like to know is, what are some common forensic techniques used by historical fiction writers to solve mysteries or crimes that are set in the past?
Okay, well, of course, they didn't have the techniques that we have now, but bloodstains are very good. I just sold a short story that used a technique that was described by a Chinese magistrate 3,000 years ago, where he used flies to detect which
larvae
suspect.
stages and there's different kinds of flies that are attracted to particular pieces of raw meat material and such.
Yeah. So one of the suspects, the flies were attracted to his knife, and they ignored the others. So that told them this one had dry blood on it that was invisible to the human eye. So and that was 3,000 years ago.
That's cool.
Yeah. I thought that was pretty cool. So that was just, I just recently sold that one. It just recently came out, so that was pretty good. Let me see. But bloodstains were good. There was, in fact, during the early days of the Roman Empire or the Roman Republic, before they had the Caesars, there was a case I read about where the centurion comes in, a Roman senator has been killed, and the only two suspects were his wife and their blind son, who was about 17 years old. And the clues were there was bloody handprints going up the side of the stairwell up to his room. And so the centurion said, well, it's obviously the mother. And why would that be? Because the blood prints were from the son. How he deduced that was, if I were to get my hands bloody and I touch the wall as I move along, those handprints are going to get fainter and fainter and fainter. These stayed just as bright all the way. The second thing, this boy has lived in this house his entire life. Why would he have to feel his way up to his room if he lived there, even though he was blind? And so based upon those two facts, he concluded it was the wife and not the son. So it's observation. Professor Bell, he was able to deduct oftentimes a person's malady when they walked in the room. He could tell what their profession was. He could tell, what route they took to come to the exam room that day just by careful observation of how they walked, the pattern of calluses on their hand, the mud stains on their trousers. So observation, that you don't need a lab for that if you're just a very good observer. Now, the very first crime lab came out in 1910 in Lyon, France. A guy who had studied both law and medicine. His name was Locard, and Locard came up with what he called the contact principle. And the contact principle states that no two solid objects can come into contact with each other, while each one leaving some trace upon the other. In other words, a criminal can't leave the scene of a crime without leaving some trace of themselves behind, and the scene of the crime leaving some trace upon them. And that's still a basic principle of forensics today. In fact, if someone hacks into your computer and empties your bank account, they're going to leave some trace of their computer on your system, and your system is going to leave some trace upon theirs. So it's even valid in the digital world.
When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
There you go.
And and as in this quote, what do you use? What method do you use to help you eliminate the impossible or the improbable when you are doing your research and putting together your novel?
Okay, I go from the opposite direction. I go like, what actually happened? And then I say, well, okay, what red herrings, what false trails can I lay to confuse the reader to make them consider other possibilities? I'm looking through the other end of the telescope when I do that. So I do try to come with something that's plausible, but at the end of the day, if you carefully analyze the various options, the only one, the true method, remains.
William, please ask your next question.
Well, I was going to say, in terms of, leaving traces to each other and things like that, since you had brought up the hackers and such, I know it would probably be a safe assumption that you could probably agree with me on this one, Brad, but I know, speaking for myself, whenever I drop my computer off to the repair shop, I'm always like, please don't look at the search history. I'm an author. So,
don't call the FBI.
Yeah, exactly. So,
let's just leave it alone. All right. Historical fiction. How can authors accurately depict the limitations and advancements of forensic science during specific time periods?
Well, of course, the first book, I had an out. I have A Knife in the Fog is written as a fictional memoir by Arthur Conan Doyle in 1923, thinking back to 1888 when the Ripper killings occurred. So I have him at one point comment that, if only we had fingerprints were available at that point, maybe we could have caught the killer sooner. So in there I was able to do some commentary without going through the fourth wall, if you will, about the limitations of that time contrasted with a more modern era. But I personally think it's a good thing to show the limitations that the detective has to deal with. That helps to bring out how intelligent they are, how good they are at reasoning, deductive reasoning. In fact, my first book, Knife in the Fog, has been translated into Japanese, and it's done pretty well in Japan. And I was surprised to learn from my friend, my co-author in the book coming out. She teaches in Japan. She says that Japanese students in high school study Sherlock Holmes stories as exercises in deductive and inductive reasoning
Mhm.
to teach them, logic. And so I think it always goes back to a person who's observant and who can think logically, who can reason things out, and the limitations of the technology just enhances the ability of the detective.
Excellent.
I know, right? You also work as a speaker and an educator. You've taken your experiences, your perspective, and you have stood in front of classes and those who are your peers to speak on these particular topics. What do you feel has been your greatest gain from talking with these people, and how do you take that and put it into your writing?
Okay, I use it as fuel. The feedback I get from an audience when I give a presentation, that first of all, it's reassuring. If I find something interesting, more often than not, other people will find it interesting as well. But it helps me to refine how I explain things, how I can think about things. And I'm sure this has happened to you. Sometimes you're having some sort of problem and you're not sure what to do. Just by explaining it to someone else, it helps you to figure out the best course for yourself. And so when I'm giving talks and I'm explaining things, especially if I'm having trouble with a story point, by verbalizing it and seeing how people respond to different things, that helps me to figure out what might work in a story that I'm working on at that time. But I say, yeah, talking to other people who are interested feeds me, and if they're not interested, then it's my job to make it interesting. Otherwise, why? I don't want to waste anyone's time. In fact, I've learned that, the average American has a 7-second attention span. And so I've got to keep hitting a person's consciousness with something new, something curious, some twist to keep them going through that story. And just as comparison, a goldfish has a 9-second attention span. And so
I keep hearing that.
yeah, so that's put the onus on me as the writer of the creator of that world to keep that story going. And I learned one of the things I learned from my agent. Well, first thing she did when she looked at my manuscript, without reading a word, first thing she said, "There's not enough white space." Had these huge long blocks, these enormous paragraphs that would go half a page, and so, oh wow, you're right. It was like a biology textbook or something. So the first thing I did was I broke my paragraphs into smaller pieces. She also more dialogue. Dialogue breaks it up, makes it easier in the eye. The second thing is I had chapters that were 22, 26 pages long. Now my average chapter is 8 to 10. I never go past 12 pages. So it's easy to keep going. You finish that chapter. Well, how long's the next one? Oh, that's only 8 pages, whatever. I'll do that. And that's how you keep that reader going, keep that story going, and feed that goldfish.
So my little goldfish mind is all about, okay, so you wrote this really cool book, A Knife in the Fog, and you hit a number of plateaus that were in this book. Number one was your first book after an amazing career, but then you did a full 180 and you're like, I gotta do something different. Now I have a hankering to get my, oh, you know what? Do you use paper, pen, or do you use computer?
Yes.
Or both?
Yes. I'll brainstorm. And when I brainstorm, actually I have a big white board, a little big white board with the magic marker thing, the dry erase. And when I brainstorm, I'll start writing things down. Okay, how can I connect this to that? What facts do I want in there? What scenes do I think are interesting? And I'll kind of map that out. And then I'll take a 3x5 cards, and I'll write down critical scenes I think should be in the story. And then once I have those, before I start writing the whole story, I write the ending. I always write the ending first because I decide, okay, what's the final image? What emotion do I want the reader to have when they're finished with the story? So the ending is the first thing I write. The next thing I decide is, where does my story begin? And I've been a judge for contests, and a common mistake I see in young writers is they'll start the story too soon. And I like to give the comparison of the Odyssey by Homer. You know, Homer could have started the Odyssey right after the Trojan War. Ulysses gathers his crew, he outfits the ship, they leave the shore of Troy and start off on their adventures home. He starts the story where Ulysses is already in big trouble. He's just got released from Calypso, so unfortunately we lose all those sex scenes. There you go. But his wife is struggling to try to preserve the kingdom. Telemachus is of course fighting with the suitors and getting some help from Mentor, and you just have all the story begins with things already in motion, and you got this ticking clock where Ulysses has to get back in time before the suitors, cause a civil war back in his home of Ithaca. So it's so you want to start you want to get as close to the crux of the story as possible. As one famous writer said, you want to get in too late and leave too early. Yeah. So that's the other thing. So where can my story legitimately begin and my reader isn't totally confused?
I often ask authors how they are introduced to their characters. Do they appear in, like, say, a green screen room, in a green room, and they're all sitting there just waiting to be addressed? Or do they, at really odd times, appear and say, my name is, and this is my situation? Or do you have to piecemeal them together, kind of like Frankenstein, and make them into something that you feel will be amenable to going along your journey line?
Okay. Well, the book that's coming out in that I'm working on right now, the Titanic story, it's a heist.
Yeah.
And one of the crucial elements or the tropes of a heist is the ringleader auditioning and selecting different members of the crew. They're going to have to pull this caper off. And I sort of go through that process, say, okay, this is the story I want to use. Now, if I'm using real people, then it's more or less, okay, I'm going to use this person, whatever. They kind of come already prepackaged. But even so, what role will they play in the story? What voice will they have? And then I kind of assign them a role or a part to play in the story. In the Titanic story, I do use some real people, but I also come up with some fictional people, and the fictional people have to come up with a skill set that my main characters don't have, but that skill set will contribute to the overall story plot and aid in the resolution. And so it's sort of a process, but I think of the role first. What does this character need to do? And then I kind of fill in from there. Oftentimes I don't have a name. The names just come to me. One of the things I use when I came back from Scotland, I brought this back with me. This, for you people under than 40 years of age, this is a phone book. And when I need a name, I can't think of a name, I just go through here and let me see. We have, that's business. Back over here. And we have Nadal Rodap. I probably wouldn't use that name, but anyway, you get the idea. You know, and also, okay, this character has a name that starts with R or ends in R, so I need to find somebody whose last name starts with something different, so you don't get them confused. And so I can pull this phone book out and dig through there and come up with names. And you know, if I like the sound of it, you know, I'll work with it. By the way, names are very important. Conan
Yes.
Conan Doyle's original names for his two characters was Sherlock Holmes. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a huge hero of his, so Holmes was going to happen. But the first name was originally Sherlock, and Dr. John Watson was Ormond Sacker.
Wow.
let's be grateful that didn't work.
How did he, do you know how he came about those particular names when he was making adjustments?
I don't know why he went from Sharonford to Sherlock. Although if you saw the BBC Sherlock series, the last season, the sister of Sherlock Holmes, the institution she's kept in is called Sharonford.
Yep.
Kind of a tribute to that.
Oh.
But Ormond Sacker, I don't know. I've never heard a name like that before in my life, but it changed to Dr. John Watson because Doyle met a physician named John Watkins who lived like a street over from him and decided that was a more English sounding name, and went with that instead.
Yeah, but who knows? Maybe in an alternate universe, we do have Sherlock
And Ormond Sacker.
Yes.
Would you like to talk about the multiverse? Because we can do like a forensic study on quantum theory and the different, things that go along with that. But that we'll save for another day. I know I got on tangents. That's William's fault right there.
I'm not really a doctor, but I play one on TV.
Yeah, I stayed at the Holiday
All right,
Inn
so
Express,
so I got one. You're a psychologist.
yeah.
Yes.
Well, we studied behavioral science and medicine.
Okay, so in that line, out of all the characters that you have created that are not based on real life people, whom is the loudest in your mind after you stepped away from writing that character? Who remains?
Well, okay, I'd have to say Margaret Harkness. Although she was a real person, she still is a person who calls to me, the character who calls to me. She kind of like, I was going to put her in as a minor character, and she just basically told me that no, I have much more to say than that. And she's the major character in the second book. I'd like to write a third book using her, but unfortunately the publisher dropped the series after the second book. Because although it won awards, it didn't sell a whole lot of copies. So there you go. Publishing is a business after all. But I have a very good idea for the third story in the sequence, if you want me to talk about that for a minute.
Please
Yes,
do.
please.
Okay, all right. So in 1910, there was an order called the Order of St. Patrick. That's sort of like the Knights, the Order of the Thistle, Order of the Garter. The Order of St. Patrick was an order of knighthood of Irish lords who were loyal to the British crown. And they had the Ulster King of Arms was the senior officer, officer who worked for the order. The senior officer, the commander, was always the British governor of Ireland. And so he was like the knight commander, but the Ulster King of Arms was a guy who actually ran everything. And they had a tower, their office was in the tower in Dublin Castle. And in 1910, a set of very expensive jewels that were part of the order, in fact, two badges that the knight commander wore, as well as cufflinks that some of the knights would wear, denoting that they were knights, were stolen from the safe in the tower in Dublin Castle. And the custodian, the Ulster King of Arms, was a cousin to Arthur Conan Doyle. So Doyle offered to help with to try to solve the crime and to recover the jewels. His offer was turned down. The jewels were never recovered, and King Edward VII sent a senior inspector from Scotland Yard to Dublin to oversee the investigation. After about 2.5 weeks, he finished his investigation, wrote a report, and there were 2 copies. One went to the Royal Irish Constabulary, put in their archives. The other went back to Scotland Yard. Within about a year to 15 months, both copies were moved from the archives and never seen again.
Oh.
So there are some theories as to who was involved in that theft. And I would love to write a story about that and bringing back Margaret and Doyle and Bell one last time to solve the theft of the Irish crown jewels from Dublin Castle. But I'm going to have to get a publisher who'd be willing to publish a book from characters from a series that had been discontinued elsewhere. That's one of the reasons I'm really pushing to try to get the first book made into a movie, because I think that would generate enough interest that I could resurrect that series and let my 3 Musketeers, that's what they call themselves, let my 3 Musketeers ride one more time.
Talk about the 40 Thieves.
Oh, okay, the 40 Elephants or the 40 Thieves.
Or the 40
Yeah,
Elephants.
those terms are completely interchangeable. Yeah, the 40 Elephants, fascinating bit of history there. Again, something I could never have made up on my own. There's a pub. Well, there's many pubs. There's a particular pub in South London. And people from South London, by the way, are called Southies. And Southies are known for being pretty tough because it's a pretty tough part of town. Well, the Elephant and Castle has been around for centuries. From about 1780 to 1953, there was a gang of all-female criminals called the 40 Thieves or the 40 Elephants, the interchangeable. And the leader of the 40 Elephants was always called the Queen of the Elephants. So in 1912, when the Titanic sailed, the leader was a woman named Mary Carr, also called Polly. Among other things, she was also called Swan Neck, because at one point she'd worked as an artist model for some pretty famous artists because she had this long, elegant neck. So she was the leader of the gang, and they would do blackmail. Shoplifting was what they were really good at. And you can imagine when Harrods and Selfridges opened up department stores, my goodness, that was just a feeding ground for them. I think I read that one year, like 1908 or something, Selfridges reported that had over 350 very expensive gowns stolen from them in 1 year. So that's almost one per day.
Oh my!
As Scotland Yard got more sophisticated, and as they started putting in store detectives, Pinkerton's, by the way, was a big source of that. And their store detectives were all women, so they could go back in the dressing rooms and that sort of thing. But anyway, what the 40 Thieves did then is they would hit like 10 or 12 department stores all at the same time. So the police were just overwhelmed. They didn't know which way to go. And once they had cars, they typically had cars that were faster than the police. The Scotland Yard came up with what they called the Flying Squad. That was the first cars that had radios, so they could dispatch a car and give it directions, and they could chase wherever the thieves had gone. So to overcome that, the 40 Thieves one day, 12 different cars rammed 12 different jewelry stores. They had 3 women in each car. 2 of them jumped out and went to just ransack the store as much as they could and jump back in. And one of the ladies, she had put on heavy duty bumpers on her front of the car so she could ram through the plate glass window. She even had a periscope so she could look behind her to monitor the approach of the constabulary and make a clean getaway. So I mean, they were very sophisticated. They also had, yeah. They also had the wildest parties in London because South London, life was brutal and short. So they had a big score. They celebrated. Some of the poshest restaurants and some of the aristocrats would just, fight over the chance to attend a party with the 40 Elephants because it was just so, scandalous and cool at the same time. Let me see. Oh, and anyway, Mary Carr, she instituted a policy that 10% of all the proceedings were kept in a contingency fund. So when a member of the gang was arrested, she would use the contingency fund to hire a barrister. Most people went before the judge without any sort of legal representation. So if you belonged to the gang and you got caught, you had a much better chance of getting off, or at least a reduced sentence, than someone who was working on their own. So there was a big incentive to belong to the gang. Now, she ran the 40 Elephants with a very strict code called the Hoisters Code. Hoisters and people who would hoist things from stores or wallets or whatever. You couldn't drink just before or during a job. If you the women could not date or be married to men who were not criminals themselves, because that man could be potentially leveraged to become a source of information to the police down the road. And they never wore anything that they stole, because that would trace it back to them. And so they were, they ran. It was almost like joining a sorority in a way. And if a woman was put in jail, in prison, the 40 Elephants would pay the rent on her flat. If they had children, made sure the children were being taken care of. So it was kind of a benevolent society as well. And a lot of women coming up very poor and no education. This was the best opportunity they had, short of, to provide for themselves and for their families. And a lot of them were married to criminals. They would occasionally use men where muscle was involved, but more often than not, it was just the women, and they preferred to, not to use violence. So just a fascinating history of crime that a lot of people don't know much about. The woman after Mary Carr was named Alice Diamond, and she would wear a ring on each finger of both hands. It was said that she could knock a man flat with one blow. And she once had to be forcibly removed from the Kit Kat Club, which was a very prestigious nightclub in London, when they refused her membership because she was, after all, Alice Diamond. And she thought there was no problem with that, but the establishment didn't want that kind of reputation. So there you go.
Talk about Reflection in a Dragon's Eye, which is coming out September 15th.
Yes, ma'am. Well, thank you for that segue. That's a modern contemporary police procedural. A police procedural is different than your typical detective story. Sherlock Holmes pretty much works on his own. In a police procedural, you have different aspects of the police department, working together as a team. So you see the forensic guys doing this, the photographers doing their thing, and just all together, you see how the process, if you will, comes together to help solve a particular crime. But of course, I have two main characters on the police department that are involved, and I used as the premise for the story something I learned about in medical school. It's called situational dependent learning, and in that particular condition, if someone is drunk or very high, and they encode a memory, something happens, and they sober up or they get, dry out. Afterwards, they oftentimes cannot remember that whatever happened. But if you return them to the same physiologic state, oftentimes they can recapture that memory. So the basic story is, I have a homeless man, a former prize fighter. He witnesses a body dumped by a serial killer. It's in front of the killer's boat, and the masthead is a mythological creature, which, it's New Year's night, fireworks are going off, he's drunk, he's frightened out of his mind by this body in front of him, so he believes the masthead, that figure, is a dragon. So he goes off, hits his head, slips on the ice, hits his head, a cop finds him before he freezes to death. He tells a policeman, the street cop, I saw a woman killed by a dragon. He said, yeah, sure. Takes him to the emergency room, spends the night. Next morning, he still remembers sort of what happened. And he sees it as a vision from God saying, this is your last chance to sober up and get your life straight. So he takes the pledge, goes to DT's, a terrible time, suffering as his body dries out, gets to the other side, and really is working hard to maintain his sobriety. In the meantime, the detective, they find the body, and the body fits a certain profile of women who'd gone missing over the last 3 years. So they're thinking, this is probably a woman who was murdered by the guy who made these other women disappear, and he's slipped up somewhere that we found the body this time. And the detective, she just got promoted from the street, so she's really kind of assisting the sergeant on this case. And she goes through all the police records, reports of that time period where the woman was probably killed, and sees this one note, a field report from one of the cops. Oh, found this guy, and he mentioned that he saw a woman killed by a dragon. Well, the location is kind of right, the time is kind of right, and so they bring him in from the homeless shelter where he's staying, run by this Catholic priest, and psychologist talks to him and hypnotizes him and gets pretty close, but the guy is so terrified by the image that he has in his mind, he can't get through that final barrier. And so the psychologist says, well, there's definitely something there. I think he can help us shed light on this murder, but to do that, I think we'll have to take him back to the harbor at night and get him drunk. So the tagline on this story is, would you risk, putting his sobriety at risk with no guarantee at the end of the day it's really going to help you to solve these murders? So the tagline is, would you risk your soul to catch a killer? Is it ethical to even to ask this guy to risk his sobriety when there's no guarantee at the end of the day that it's going to help you catch this guy? In the meantime, you might destroy this guy's life. This might be the only time he can really get everything together and break through his cravings for alcohol and get his life straight. So that's the crux of the whole story. And I like stories that pose questions. I want to leave some work for the reader to chew on and say, well, what do I think is right? What would I do in that situation? And so that's the crux of Reflection in a Dragon's Eye.
Well, I'm forward to that.
Absolutely. All right. I'm going to move on to a different segue here. This man right here. This man right here, since we're at that point where we're talking about regaining integrity and bringing out the truth of the matter, so to speak, just the facts, ma'am or sir, and allow for the actual story in all of its grit and glory to be told by someone with whom has an interest like Doyle in finding out what really happened.
Okay, well, really quick, I'm going to respond to your Doyle reference first. Doyle did, in fact, twice clear people that were wrongly convicted of crime. He got involved. He was a big advocate of justice. So putting him in the hunt for Jack the Ripper was not that far-fetched. But okay, William, you were about to say something?
No, I was just going to say, definitely, I know Doyle had done that, and then I think he's also made it, I think it's like 3 or 4 other attempts. Yeah, 2 that were successful, but yeah. I think there was like 3 that came close, but something happened that it didn't, either the information or something in the wording made it fall through, though.
Yeah.
We do have a question from the room. Have you ever tried learning some of the more esoteric skills which your characters may need?
Well, in the second book, I have a tarot card reading early in Margaret's life that that's referred back to later, that has some foreshadowing, if you will, of her future life. And I'm not a tarot card reader, but I did consult with one, and we sat down and I spent about 2 hours with him. I kept him supplied with Starbucks coffee, and he kept doing readings and showing me how it's done. And then I says, okay, this is the life of this one character. This is how it turns out. So putting her at the age of 15, could you provide a reading that would support her later life? And he came up with that and something. Of course, there's a lot of interpretation to tarot, which actually is I enjoy. There's a lot of room for for interpretation, as there is in a good story. But he helped me to craft up the reading that I give my character in the story. So there is that. I have autopsies done in the first book. I've done forensic autopsies myself, and so I already had that esoteric skill. And of course, in the second one, I have my assassin is a marksman, and for 6 months as an infantry officer, I ran all the small arms ranges at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and I probably fired 5,000 rounds downrange during that time. So I had that skill as well. I was got some training, as a marksman in addition to just the basic marksmanship training, and I use that in my story. But as far as other esoteric things, let me think. I'm pretty lazy at some things, so what I do was on the book, The Dragon's Eye. I have a good friend, Mark Bergen. Mark Bergen is retired. He's a writer. He writes mysteries, or detective stories, I should say, more hard-boiled. And he's a retired police lieutenant from the Alexandria, Virginia Police Department, and he was a journalist before he became a cop. And so what I do is I run my stuff by him, and he tells me what works and what doesn't work. For example, I put snow chains on a police car, and he said, no, we would never put snow chains on a police car. They come flying off, they would damage the car. He said, we go with all weather tires. We don't do snow tires because you have to change them. You have a large fleet, that's too much logistics.
Right.
And another time I had one of my detectives wearing mittens. And he said, we never wear mittens. If we had to pull our gun quickly, you're not going to
It would just fly. Everything would be going everywhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You couldn't get your finger in the
No.
on the trigger in time, So, dumb things that I would do. And of course he said, you always sit with you facing the door if you're having a cup of coffee or whatever. And some of the things, the mindset of what it's like to be a working cop. And also I gave one person too much rank. In this story, he says, no, by the time you make a lieutenant, which what he was at, he says, you're dealing with the upper management. You're assigning cases to people. You're not personally involved in these things anymore. And so I demoted one of my characters and made him a sergeant instead. And he said that's much more realistic.
Let me ask you this, since we're talking about character.
Hmm.
Have you ever had a character, you developed it, you're moving along the lines, and then they turn around and they look at you and they say, there is no way on God's green earth I am going to do that.
Yes. In fact, I made it a point in the first book. My three main characters, each of them says, what's the one thing they would never do? And then I made them do it and made it plausible.
There we go.
Yeah, so I made them do something that was out of character, that was totally believable at that moment in that situation. And that was the challenge I set for myself as a writer.
So we're going to go back to this gentleman behind me, Mr. Bruce Ismay.
Mm.
There were a number of situations in real life where he had been verbally torn to shreds.
Mm.
This was after the critical event of the Titanic and the sinking of it.
Mm.
He was able to come back. He did survive. But his mind did not survive. Can you speak on any elements of post-traumatic stress disorder, which they didn't know that was a thing back there, but can you talk about the elements that he would have gone through as you wrote in your book, Maiden's Voyage?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Ismay got a really bum rap, I think. In the movie, James Cameron's movie is very good on the whole. He got most things right. One thing he got wrong was he cast Ismay as a villain, and has Ismay encourage the captain to increase his speed, and leading into the collision with the iceberg. In point of fact, the White Star Line, their biggest competitor well, Cunard, of course, but for luxury, but the German ships, the Northern German line, they had the fastest ships. They were called the German Greyhounds. And the White Star Line made a deliberate decision. We're not going to compete with the Germans on speed. They can go as fast as they want in these cramped little noisy ships. We're going to go large. We're going to go comfortable. I mean, they're not going to just lollygag. I mean, it still went 21 knots. But he never told the captain to speed up. There was no chance that they were going to go faster than the Germans. There was no interest in doing that. That's the first thing. The second thing is that Ismay, he got on the last lifeboat only after he made sure that there was no one else around. The seat was going to go empty. And at the last minute, he said, okay, I'll take the seat. And he took that was something that haunted him the rest of his life, that he lived and so many others died. And he heard the screams of people as they slowly died from hypothermia in the 28-degree North Atlantic. So that he had survivor's guilt, basically. And we call it in the Army the last sergeant, the old sergeant, the one who survives when everyone else in their unit is killed. And of course, the question they ask is why? Why me? Why? I was no better than they are. In fact, a lot of them, they think they were better than I was, and they died, and I lived. How do I justify that I survived and they did not? So that's been known in military circles for a very long time. There's different names for it, but yeah, he was haunted with guilt more than anything else. What could he have done differently? And there were a lot of, as a physician, I've sat on risk management boards where we look at cases, where things had a really bad outcome. And doing kind of analysis of the Titanic, I found a similar thing, that usually if one thing goes wrong, okay, so what? But for the true disaster to happen, you have to have a series of events to all go wrong at the right time in the right place for a true catastrophe. And one example I like to give is Frederick Fleet, the lookout who saw the iceberg at the last possible moment. If he had seen it any later, the ship would not have had time to move at all, would have hit it straight on. Would have been a pretty hard knock, but maybe the first two compartments might have been compromised, but the ship would not have sank. If he'd seen it sooner, they would have missed it entirely. So they had binoculars. If he'd had binoculars, he could have seen the iceberg, but the binoculars were locked in a box in the lookouts in the crow's nest, and the officer with the key was transferred at the last minute. Didn't have the key, and of course, this is White Star property. We're not going to break open the box, get the binoculars out. So it's a series of things like that Ismay had no control over. He had the ship built to a very high standard of safety. There was no requirement for them to have enough lifeboats for everyone. Initially, very few passengers were even willing to get in lifeboats. Said, "This is the Titanic. It's unsinkable. It's freezing cold out there. I'm nice and warm and dry here. I'm not going to get on that boat." So it was only at the last, as the ship was obviously really going down, and suddenly, seats on that lifeboat were very, very popular. But initially, the first couple of boats left almost, less than half full, partly because they didn't trust the stanchions, and partly because they couldn't get enough passengers to get on the boats to even fill them. So
Exactly.
yeah, so he was painted with he got a bad rap for things he had no control over, but which he felt responsible. And he pretty much, in fact, the 3 days on the Carpathia, he was in the captain's cabin and didn't leave the cabin the entire time. And as soon as they pull into New York Harbor, what's the first thing that happens? Senator Smith from the U.S. Senate, who's going to lead the inquiries, gets on board the ship and serves him with a summons to appear before the commission the next day. So he immediately goes from the shock of this to being grilled by some pretty angry people about how could you have let this happen. And so that marked him for life, and he never really recovered from that. And then, of course, he goes back to England, has to go through it all again with the British Board of Trade. And they had no reason not to make him the villain, because they're the ones who said, "Oh, this ship is fine to be put into service. It exceeds all our standards. Have a nice day." And so, to shift any blame from them, they made sure that Ismay got the worst possible press and treatment that they could possibly manufacture.
William, this is your area of expertise. You have given a lot of lectures, you have sat on panels, and you have studied this for decades.
Yeah.
What one question would you like to approach Mr. Bradley with that would give you a better understanding of the event itself?
Okay. Probably one of the best questions to ask. And, obviously coming from the historian's perspective, you go through numerous hours of research and, testimony and everything along those lines. During the course of putting Maiden Voyage together, have you come across anything in terms of the passengers and the crew that you actually did use and incorporate into the book? Anything that kind of struck out to you that was, not really commonly brought to light beforehand at all?
One of the characters that I fell in love with is Margaret, or Molly Brown. Her
Yeah.
background was fascinating, and the person herself, I mean, she really greatly exceeded her background. She grew up one of, I think, 7 or 8 children in a very poor family. She stripped tobacco. She goes to Leadville, Colorado, and she was determined to marry a rich man because she was tired of being poor.
Mm-hmm.
She meets this mining engineer, Mr. Brown, who's pretty poor actually, but that she fell in love. They fell in love, and so she said, "Okay, I'll marry for love." Then Mr. Brown finds gold in them their hills, and they're suddenly pretty darn rich.
Yep.
She never forgot where she came from. She was always very involved in philanthropic works, and in fact, when they were on the Carpathia going back to New York City after they'd been rescued, she spent those 3 days tending to the third-class passengers. And when they arrived in New York City, she refused to leave the docks. Oh, when they got to New York City, first of all, they went to the White Star Line dock to offload the lifeboats because that property belonged to the White Star Line. Then finally they come back to Kennard Pier and says, "Okay, we can get off this boat now." First class passengers first, then the second class passengers, and then the third class passengers. So, one final indignity after all they'd been through was that the third class passengers had to wait until all their betters had gotten off the boat first. Well, Mary Brown refused to leave the docks until she made sure every single third class passenger had some place to spend the night. And another thing is, for fitness, she boxed for fitness. Now, she didn't spar. She didn't want her face, marked up, but she worked the heavy bag every day. And so I found that interesting. And so I use her boxing training in one scene in my story, which I really enjoy. And I'll just leave it at that.
So please tell me I get the right picture over here.
That is it. Yes, indeed.
That's her. Now, I will say this much for sure. One of the things, since you gave me the honor of being one of your beta readers for Maiden Voyage, and I'm absolutely still thrilled to have done so. And just like with Knife in the Fog, I actually was kind of partially joking with Jackie about this the other night. My initial read through, originally my game plan was I was going to maybe read 1 or 2 chapters and then call it a night, just given the hour that it was. So lo and behold, next thing I know, I get to the final page, and all of a sudden I hear my wife's alarm at 2:30 in the morning because she works the morning shift at retail. And I'm like, "What are you doing up?" And she's like, "Well, I'm going to work. What are you doing up?" And I'm like, I'm going to bed. So right off the bat, just like with the first book, it was absolutely engrossing. I mean, it hooked me. For myself, it hooked me within the first 3 pages.
Oh, thank you very much. That's
So,
quite an honor.
On that.
And then, just real quick, Jackie, I also notified a number of the descendants for whom I'm very good friends with about, because understandably, this is the subject matter that is extremely close to their hearts. And there have been multiple cases where people have taken advantage and put out material that would be borderline offensive
Yeah.
without the examples and such. So just to tell you from their perspective, Helen Benziger, who happens to be Margaret's great granddaughter, was tickled pink with the book. She enjoyed reading it. Cliff Ismay had said that should you come across the puddle, and if both of the schedules are able to correlate perfectly, maybe stop by the pub for a couple of pints. Then celebrate from one author to another. So you're hitting all the right marks. Especially in terms of the Titanic community itself. And so, I mean, this is one of those things where, even though it's a part of pop culture today and everything else to that effect, a lot of people don't realize the ripple effects are still there in a lot of cases. And so,
the changes made in marine safety are still indicative. I mean, still in effect today. The agreement on the safety of life at sea, or the SOLAS convention, was signed shortly after the inquiries were done. The last was last updated in 2015, and the requirement that everyone, passengers and crew, have a lifeboat drill before the ship leaves harbor is a direct result of the inquiries into the sinking of the Titanic.
Yep, exactly.
So I asked, excuse me, Mr. Brower, out of all of the characters that are in the maiden voyage, which one he most identified with. And so just say the name of the person that you identify with.
Don't say Bruno.
No, not Bruno. No worries. No. Believe it or not, Thomas Andrews.
Okay, now
I can see that.
From your background,
oh God,
Dr. Bradley Harper,
ma'am,
I would like to know how you would describe Mr. Brower in his psychological makeup, that he would choose this particular character to most identify with.
Okay. Thomas Andrews was the naval architect who designed the Olympic line. The Olympic was the first, the Titanic was the second, and the Britannic was the third. And he worked his way up, although his uncle was the managing director at one point. He worked his way up. He did the grunt work. He didn't ride in anyone's coattails. And he was a very meticulous man. He took great pride in his work. And, he probably did, in fact, inspect every single rivet that went into the Titanic at one point or the other. And he designed everything had to do with that ship. He knew that ship. You could have blindfolded him, and he would have could have given you a guided tour of the entire ship, which at the time that it sailed was the largest moving object ever made by man. So, I mean, that tells you something. So he was a man who paid great attention to the small things, took pride in his knowledge, was very meticulous. That being said, a lot of people that are very detailed focused are very introspective and not very good at social skills. Thomas Andrews was beloved by the crews of the ships that he designed, because he would ask them, how can I make your life better on board ship? And no one had ever asked him that before. He came up with rubber flooring in some areas to reduce the shock. He made sure that each of the stewardesses had their own wardrobe, as before they had to share one, and gave them larger rooms, and just did a lot of little details that showed that he thought the crew, they were of a lower social standing than he was, but he treated them like human beings with respect. And in fact, when the Olympic sailed, the crew had a little reception for him, and they gave him a walking stick because he was constantly walking all over the ship, checking on things. He got varicose veins because he was always on his feet, and the esteem that they held him with because he was a man who didn't hold himself above anyone else, and cared about others, and what was very focused on doing and whatever he did to do it as well as could possibly be done.
You just described William to a T.
And now you're making me blush. Thank you.
You're very welcome. That's the way Thomas Andrews was, and the way everything I know of you that reflects you as well.
Brad.
Well, thank you, Brad.
Brad. Your works are an introspection into humanity at a very microcosmic level. Each part of your psychological emotion, each part of the character's psychological emotion is examined in the most purest form through your character-driven experiences. The audience views each situation as if they were there. Your attention to historical detail breathes life into each line and renews the strength and weaknesses of those wrongly accused and gives them back their dignity. All of this you have accomplished, and yet your most glowing aspect is your humbleness.
Well, thank you. All right, a little background. When I was in high school and then later in college, I made my spending money working as a waiter at Southern Hills Country Club in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This was the exclusive country club in Tulsa. A lot of oil company presidents belonged to that. Oral Roberts, if you ever heard of him, he belonged. So the high and mighty, the very wealthy of that community belonged to this country club, and they had a very high entrance fee. So only the rich could afford to work there. When I would work there, I was usually the only non-African American working as a waiter, and most of the other waiters, these were grown men. They were, I was making date money. They're making money to support their families. And I remember one night it was a Kentucky Derby night, and a big deal, and mint juleps to be had, and everyone was all dressed up. And so two of the older gentlemen asked if I would bus tables for them. They said, if you do that, we can work more tables, we'll get more tips. I said, sure. It was all the same to me. In fact, it's easier to bus a table. Just make sure they got the coffee, clear out the plates, that sort of thing, and let the waiters deal directly with the customer. So that was fine with me. In the night, I'm hanging up my jacket, turning it into laundry, whatever, I'm getting to go. These two men both hunted me down and handed me money. And I said, what's this? They said, because we could work more tables, we got more tips. This is your share. Okay, again, I'm a college kid. I'm not wealthy, but I'm lower middle class family. I'm doing okay. These guys are working their butts off to support their family. They gave part of their tips to this young white boy who bussed their tables. And at that moment, again, lower working class, they had the dignity of kings.
Yeah.
And I said, and I learned that night that dignity is a gift, but it's a gift that only you can give yourself. But it's available to everyone.
Wow. And I mean, what can I say? I mean, you definitely not only demonstrated even now, but I can say that you are definitely, without a doubt, one of the best examples of the standard term of an officer and a gentleman. You know how to handle and conduct yourself extremely well done. So
thank you very much.
So now we're going to
Yes.
go over to something totally completely awesome. And I wish I could have really gotten the whole picture in there. And if you check my page on Zombie Palooza Radio Live, I will have all of the photos. But this, I wasn't able to get the name into it because it's really at the very, very top and all of that. But it's a vampire.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes, it is.
It is.
I'm going to get out of the way and as much as I possibly can. I love her green eyes too. And look at that cheeky little smile she has on her face. Please talk about this film.
Okay, that's an animation. It's about 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I think a pearl driver could probably hold her breath the entire length of the time. And when I was in command at Fort Lee, Virginia, I was going through a really tough time. I won't go into the details, but I mean, I was borderline suicidal. I'll just put it like that. I wrote this poem about a man who has an encounter with a vampire to kind of, again, to put my inner world, my inner thoughts and feelings, to externalize that so I could look at it and analyze it. And years later, when I was just before I did my master's degree in Scotland, a full sail graduate, Wes Locker.
Yeah.
He has helped produce some comic books. So I got with him and I shared the poem with him, and we contracted a young man and produced this comic book right here, Dark Tryst, where basically take my poem and put it on panels, made it real.
This is so cool. Look at that.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah. So anyway, and it, I give it away. I sell it for a couple bucks. When I'm at events, if someone comes up and buys a book, say here, have a comic book or whatever, and I put it in the swag bags just to kind of let people know about me. But anyway, after I finished my master's at Full Sail, I took a screenwriting class, workshop, and really enjoyed it a lot. And so I came to me that I could make this poem into an animation, and basically use the storyboard, or rather the comic book, the panels in the comic book as the storyboard for the animation. So I found an animator, and the gentleman who narrated my first book, the audiobook, Knife in the Fog, he's formerly with the Royal Shakespeare Company, and the audiobook won Audiophile Magazine's Earphone Award, Best Mystery of 2019. So I mean, he's really got serious chops. He volunteered to narrate the thing for free. He's out just for fun. What the heck? Okay, I'm not gonna turn that down. So yeah, I am part Scot after all. So he narrated it, and the young gentleman in Slovenia animated it, and they used my poem and the panels, and so just on a whim. And then for the soundtrack, I contacted Jill Tracy. Jill Tracy does a lot of gothic stuff. She at one point. She's best known for the soundtrack to the silent movie Nosferatu.
Yep.
But she's known in the goth community. She does really dark, kind of twisted stuff, and just a real delight. So I licensed one of her pieces as the soundtrack, and the running time and the song meshed perfectly. It could not have designed that any better than the way it turned out. And so put it together, the entire animation between everything, the animator and Jill and the free narration. It was about $2,000 altogether. I entered it in a bunch of contests, and it's been winning awards all over Europe. It even won an award in Bali. In Paris, it won the best midnight movie, which I thought was pretty cool.
Excellent. I mean, I'll say this much: it's definitely a fun read, and
I need to get a copy. It has to be signed.
Yeah.
And just let me know the details of all of that, because super cool. I want that on a t-shirt too. Can I get that on a t-shirt?
Sure, why not?
I'd wear it on the show.
Yeah, you could. Well, there's one bookstore that has some signed copies, the Fountain Bookstore in Richmond, Virginia. And they've been very nice to me. They've done book launches for both of my books so far. They're going to do the one in September. And so just as a gimme to them, I gave them like 25, 30 copies. I signed them all and said, and I promote that. So they're $5 because they have to pay the shipping and all like that. So the Fountain Bookstore in Richmond, Virginia, and if you want a signed copy, you can get one from them, and they'd be happy for the business. But I'm a huge believer in supporting independent bookstores. At one point when I was in high school, my dream was to have a bookstore of my own. And one day I realized, I would starve to death. I'd be reading a book, a customer would come in, and I'd say, well, let me finish this chapter, whatever. Or they want to buy a book. I said, no, you can't have that book. Why not? Well, I haven't read it yet. I can't sell it to you. So I would starve. But even so, to this day, my mother was a librarian, my daughter's a librarian, and my mother is how my wife and I met. So, so books are in my blood, my DNA, and I like to support bookstore owners as much as I possibly can.
That makes two of us. I mean, if ever anyone would like to know what about Achilles' heel, for me, it's bookstore, book sale, rare out of print books, or all of the above in one big sign. Guaranteed, like a black hole, you're going to see me vanish within the walls, and I might come back maybe 24, 48 hours later, but don't look at the bill 30 days later after that. That's all.
All right. What gets you excited about what you're doing?
I'm having fun. When my older girl was 12 years old, we were in Heidelberg, Germany at the time, and for some reason I was home when she got home from school. And so she comes home from school. She says, Daddy, can I go over to so-and-so's house and play? I said, did you do your homework? She said, yeah, we had study hall today. And if she said she did it, she absolutely had done it. Both my daughters were just really good that way. They were both great kids to raise. And I said, did you do your chores? Yeah, all caught up. Okay, good. I said, go and have fun. Maybe home by 6 o'clock for dinner. She said, great. She goes to the door. She stopped. She looked at me. She said, Daddy, how old do I have to be before I can do what I want to do? And I was like 45 at the time. He says, honey, I don't know. I'm not there yet.
There we go.
Now I'm there. I'm doing what I want to do. I'm, like I said, I don't play golf. I don't hunt or fish. I don't have a boat. So I like to keep engaged. I'm curious. I'm not the smartest person you'd ever meet, but I'm probably one of the most curious. And it's that curiosity that keeps me going, keeps me turning that page in my life, see what is next. When I used to teach the physician's assistants course in the U.S. Army for PAs, at the beginning of every semester, the first class of that semester, I would write a quote on the board from Plutarch. And Plutarch said, a mind is not a vessel to be filled. It is a fire to be ignited. And I said, if I can give you a hunger, a passion for this topic, I said, 10 years from now, half of what I taught you will either be proven to be wrong or certainly incomplete. So if it's not important, I'm not going to teach it to you. But I'm going to give you a foundation and a love of this subject so that as new information comes along, you have a good foundation and you continue to grow as a healthcare provider. And so this is not the end of your journey about learning about this, but the beginning.
Who are your favorite living writers?
Okay, I have a lot, but let me see. There is one, Sean Cosby. He writes very gritty. He's an African-American gentleman from Southeast Virginia, and he remembers where he came from. He writes about characters from that part of the country. The voices are very real, and his second book, Razor Blade Tears, is just a very, very powerful book. A young African-American man and a young Caucasian gentleman are gay, and they're married, and they are murdered. And the father, who is a racist of the white boy, and the father of the black African-American gentleman despite their very strong dislike of one another and cultural biases, join together to help solve the crime when the police department, the sheriff's department, really doesn't care. And so the bonding of two very disparate individuals who are joined by the love of their sons to try to get justice for them. I mean, that's just a very, very powerful story. And I love that to death. Another writer that I love is Joe. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. IDE. Joe IDE. I don't know. Joe. He writes a character called IQ. IQ is basically a modern day Sherlock Holmes in South LA. Again, he's a young African American gentleman, and he kind of recreates the stories of Sherlock Holmes in a modern setting and a very unique way. And Joe, he'll grab you on the first page and won't let go until the final sentence is done in that book. He is a very powerful writer, and I'm just marvel at his ability to make you hunger to find out what's going to happen next and to care about his very flawed but very human characters. So yeah, great writer. Lindsay Faye, Faye, Lindsay, Lyndsay, Lindsay Faye, Say, Lindsay Faye. She writes Sherlock Holmes stories, pastiche. Her whole art of detection is probably the best collection of Sherlock Holmes stories I've read, written by a living author today. Each of the stories that she tells is standalone, and yet each one contributes to the overarching theme of the growing friendship and the relationship between Dr. Watson and Sherlock Holmes. And by the end of the arc, you understand how much each needs and respects the other. And so it's like a story within a story that grows with each piece of the puzzle as she tells these stories. And it's just a true, again, I bow at her mastery of the genre, and to be able to weave all these stories, sort of like the Scheherazade, that each story builds upon the next, and yet each can stand by itself. So those are three that I just really like. Ian Rankin, I've read his first book on the inspector stories, blanking, a very flawed detective in Edinburgh. I like to read that because, having lived in Edinburgh, it takes me back to those eras, and Ian Rankin is hugely popular over there. Alexander McCall Smith. His number one ladies detective agencies are a pure delight. He's a Scottish professor of law. He helped to write the Constitution in Zimbabwe, and lived there for some time. And he writes these characters. He shows their flaws, but in a very loving and kind way. And his detective, Mwatsi, who runs this detective agency, is just a pure delight. And the themes of the stories, I mean, it's not heavy drama. It's a very light, loving, lovingly told. It's not hard-boiled at all, and yet each one you just fall in love with the characters that he portrays. And if you want something, a great beach read, or on a plane, or on a cruise, and you don't want to be burdened with heavy topics like I like to wrestle with sometimes, Alexander McCall Smith is a great choice for an author.
Thank you for that. All right. Historical fiction or fictional history? How far do you like to take the facts, one way or the other?
Obviously I do make some stuff up, but I try as much as possible to stick to the real people, to the real events, and fill in the gaps, things that we don't know. Well, okay, if it's not a historical fact or we don't know for sure, and I have some room to maneuver, then I can, change things. Now, like in Jack the Ripper, I can't change the name of the victims or when or where they were found murdered. I can't change the name of the detectives, that sort of thing. But that's okay. That gives it what we call in historical fiction, we talk about the halo effect. If I tell you 5 things that are true, the 6th thing that I made up that sort of kind of fits in with the others, you're going to be more apt to believe that as well, because I've been pretty straight with you up to this point. And it's not really a lie. It's just a little fudge and maybe a little improvement, a little elaboration that we don't know isn't true. And so I helps to tell the story. So I think there's what's the word that Stephen Colbert uses there? Truthiness. There's still some truthiness in what I tell you, even if it's not an historical fact. It's close enough to the real thing that it goes along with everything else that is true.
I enjoy Mr. Lipton's questions. Hopefully you will know some of these answers pretty right away because they're one fire after the other. What is your favorite word?
Verisimilitude.
What is your least favorite word?
Can't.
What turns you on?
Unsolved puzzle.
What turns you off?
Someone who acts like they're better than everyone else.
What sound or noise do you love?
The rain.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Shoveling snow, that grating sound on the sidewalk when the metal hits the concrete.
What is your favorite curse word?
I really don't curse very much. So I don't. I guess the British word bloody.
I like that one too.
Yeah, there you
What
go.
profession other than your own would you like to attempt? But you have had many, and one that I'm saving very, very special. So don't say that one.
Okay, I would like to be a tour guide. And I've lived in Italy for a couple of years, and I love the country. I've spent a lot of time in Spain as well. And I would love to share some places that I love, little hidden gems that most people never heard of. The little village of Marostica outside of Vicenza, where I lived. It's a walled town up on a hill. It has two castles, at Castello Superiore and Inferiore. And every other year in September, they have a human chess match with knights in armor and horses and like that. And gentlemen walk around with falcons on their arms in this little village. And there's a story behind that, which I won't tell now. But I just these places that I discovered that most people have never heard of, and sharing them with other people, sharing my love of the grand diversity of the human experience.
What profession would you not like to do?
I've done so many that I try to find something good in everything that I do. Something. In fact, I made colonel in the army, and part of how I did that was I would find a job that no one else wanted, and do that, and then do it as well as I could to exceed people's expectations, and then I could use that to leverage into something which I found possibly more interesting down the road. But what would I? Gosh, I would hate to be the guy in the information booth at the airport because all day long I'd be telling people where the bathroom is.
That's totally understandable.
And the last question for this section. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say to you when you arrived at the pearly gates?
Here's your library card.
Nice.
So I have learned about my new friend that he has a very magical aspect about him, and something which gives hope and aspiration and allows for people to have a very pleasant, quiet release. This next photo will give you all you need to know. My dear new friend is actually Santa Claus. I love this. Absolutely. Talk about how you got involved in doing this and the aspects of it in which you love.
Well, I have to, it's totally my wife's fault. First of all, it's all her fault. In the Army, it's a tradition for the unit Christmas party. The commanding officer plays Santa Claus. And my wife saw how much I enjoyed doing that. So after I retired, I quit shaving because I could, and it came out, well, like this. This is my natural beard. And we live close to Busch Gardens here in Williamsburg. And she said, why don't you try out for Santa this year? And I said, well, I don't know. So she kind of pushed me in that direction. So I auditioned, and to my absolute terror, they hired me. So I said, oh, gee whiz, I don't know what's happened. So I went to the department stores, and I kind of learned about all the different toys. And I tell you, it's really a lot to know. So I start working at Busch Gardens. Initially, I was working strictly as the understudy for this for the dinner theater. And the gentleman was in his 80s, so if he had more than 3 shows, I would work the other shows, and do the night before Christmas and do the pictures and like that. And then one of the Santas over at the toy shop left their employ suddenly for reasons I won't go into here, and they needed another Santa. I said, well, I can do that too. I'm not working that hard over here. And so I said, this isn't too hard. I ask the kids what they want. They tell me, I nod, and I never promise anything. I say, I'll look into it. We do the picture, they leave, next, whatever. And it's fine. And then my third day, full time, in the toy shop, one of my elves comes up. She says, Santa, you're about to see 3 kids, a girl and her 2 younger brothers. And they were orphaned a year ago. And the foster family keeping them has just been approved to adopt all 3 of them together so they can grow up together. Their greatest fear, of course, would be they split up to different homes. And they want you to be the one to tell them. So, and I had no preparation. Boom, there they are. And there's a 12-year-old girl, and at 12, they're just kind of playing along for their younger brothers. The 10-year-old, 10, they don't really believe, but just in case they're wrong, they're going, kind of hedging their bets. The 8-year-old, he would totally believe. His eyes were enormous, brown eyes. And so I thought, what am I going to do? So I said, well, I went back on my old standard. What would you like for Christmas? And they're talking, and I'm nodding. Okay, yeah. I don't hear a single word these kids are saying. I'm in my mind, I'm like, what am I going to do? How can I tell them something like that? And they finally finished, and I nodded. I said, great, I'll look into it. And then I looked at those eyes looking at me, and then it came to me. I said, well, great ideas, but I have something for you today. And the oldest said, well, what's that, Santa? I said, a family. And that's the moment I became Santa Claus. So I've had people cry on me sometimes because someone they loved had just died and didn't make it to Christmas that year. More than once, someone was dying of cancer, and this is going to be their last Christmas. I've held babies that was their first Christmas. Some families come back year after year after year just to have their pictures taken with me with their children, and that's how they mark the progress of, the growth of their children. That's a milestone. I'll be back to see Santa Brad one more time and mark that progress, and I've been part of that life, and it's a real privilege. There's one church that we would go to. My wife does Mrs. Claus. After the first year, she came on as Mrs. Claus, and that's great. Working together with her is great. But there's one church we've done. They do a thing every year for elderly people, and especially those who with memory challenges. And I'm getting closer to time, I know. So one guy, Walter, I gave him his basket, and I bent over. There's a picture of my butt. I'm hugging Walter, but he's an older African American gentleman, probably in his late 80s, and his face is beaming, just pure beaming. And it looks like the little reflection off his bald head, looks like there's a little halo there. And that's one of my favorite pictures. And so, anyway, his daughter hunted me down. She got to people at the church and say, who is this guy? How can I contact him? She sent me that picture and she said, this is my father's favorite picture. He's got it on his desk. She said he was abandoned by his parents as a child, and he never got a visit from Santa his entire life until that day. So the next year we go back and Walter wasn't there. And the director told me that he had passed, and that at his funeral was an open casket, and his daughter had blown that picture of us together on an easel by his casket.
Wow.
So I am truly the luckiest man I know.
Yeah. And I mean, just those stories alone are some of the greatest treasures one can ever ask for. So, and it takes a lot of strength to even face them like that. So, I'll have to ask, I guess, in this case, did your training as a pathologist kind of help on giving you that inner strength, or?
Well, I can tell you that a couple of times I've been the person who brought the family member down to the morgue to identify a body, someone who died in an accident or died violently, so we could identify the body. And the first time I did that, a soldier had died. It was a Saturday afternoon. He was going in to help some scientists explore this cave that was on this training area, and he was going to go down first into the cave and guide them. And something happened. He fell way down to the cave and died from the fall. So I got a call. I was on call that weekend. I got a call from the front desk at the hospital. This woman has shown up to identify the body. And I said, well, I'll be there shortly. And so I went down to the morgue, and I didn't want her to see her husband in the morgue, this sterile place stinking of chemicals. Yeah. So because he died outside the hospital, there would have to be an autopsy, and part of the examination would be his equipment. So I couldn't change anything he was wearing, but I put a drape on the body and I cleaned the face. I put him on a gurney and put him out in a hallway. It was just her and me in the building. Then I went upstairs and I escorted her down. And I said, when we got in, and she was just pale and shaking. We got in there, and I put a chair by the gurney, and I had a chair down the hall where I could watch her. And I said, okay, we're about to turn the corner. When we do, this is what you will see. I didn't want it to come as a complete shock. So we stopped for a moment. I prepared her for the scene mentally, what she was about to experience, because I felt at that point like I was going to do a magic trick. That morning when she woke up, there was this man that she loved. He was alive. They'd spent the night together. They had breakfast. He goes off, and her world was like this. And up until she turned that corner in her mind, in her heart, her husband was still alive. This was still unreal. Yeah. I was about to make it real. And that's probably the cruelest thing I've ever done, but it had to be done. And so I prepared her as best as I could for the sight she was about to see. And she came, turned the corner. I escorted her to the gurney. She stood, she sat. I sat on the end of the hall in the corner. So she wasn't alone, but I wasn't intruding. So she knew I was there, but she could have her time alone with the body and process it. I have no idea how long we were there. I didn't keep track. I stayed there until she's ready to leave. And going through that was a tough day for me, but it wasn't 1/10 as bad as it was for her. And remembering that, I guess, maybe helped me to deal with it. And in times since, when I've had to be the bearer of bad news, I go back to that.
Oh, okay.
So, Brad, what did you think about your first interview on Zombie Palooza Radio Live?
I can't believe we've gone a little bit over 2 hours. I apologize for being so verbose, but it's been a lot of fun.
No apology needed.
Yeah, but you've asked some great questions. I'm so glad William could be part of this because he's been a huge help to me, a huge support to me, and I tell you, I owe this guy so much.
Well, I'm always happy to help friends, and like I said, you and I have one of those rare common traits. Not only are we both authors, but we also are passionate about history, and you know Lord knows, I know without a doubt, if we can get ourselves together at a bar, that manager's going to be like, yoo-hoo, it's 4 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, I think we would have a grand time, Letty. A grand time indeed. This past year, just so you know, Jackie, I was this year's at a Santa Claus. I was Father Christmas, and they asked me the first time they had Father Christmas. I was in the England part of Busch Gardens, and so they had no idea really what that meant. So you have to kind of flesh the character out. So people would come in, and I'd say, since I just come back from Scotland, I use my Scottish brogue or my imitation at least. I'd say, Father Christmas, I'm the Christmas spirit for all of Britain. Britain is 4 countries. First of all, there's Scotland. Scotland's the most important part, as you know. Then there's Wales. Then there's Northern Ireland, and finally there's England.
You nailed the Baroque very well, by the way.
Well, thank you. I heard a lot of it over that period of time. Don't ask me to do a Glasgow brogue because I don't understand those people to this day.
Don't worry. That takes a little more practice. That's all.
Yeah.
I would like you to now give your social media and let us know how we can find your works. And if we want to drop you a line and let you know what we thought about tonight's interview. And I also want to say thank you to everyone that has been watching and submitting questions and all of that other kind of cool stuff. Thank you so much for that. So please, your social media.
Okay, Facebook and I have a Bradley Harper author is my Facebook page on Facebook, and then on Twitter I'm at B Harper author, and then my website is www.bharperauthor.com. And I do a monthly newsletter. It's free. And those who subscribe, short stories, essays, poems I've written that I have a subscriber only link. You can read those up. I even have a screenplay that I wrote that got distinguished marks on my master's program there at Napier in Scotland. And so you can kind of see other things that I do that I don't put out commercially. I write just for the fun of it. And I have a lot of fun, as you can tell. So yeah, that's how you can get hold of me. If you want to, you can leave a message via my website, and I have a young lady who helps me with that, and she'll forward it to me, and I'll respond in due course. It may take me a week or so between her sending it to me and then me responding, but just next month my wife and I will celebrate our 50th wedding anniversary. So I'll be on the road for a bit, so I may be slow getting back to people while we're celebrating the first 50 years of our marriage.
Well, congratulations.
Super cool.
Thank you very much.
So, William.
Yes, Jackie.
Did it meet your expectation?
Absolutely. I was able to say that I saw Santa Claus before Christmas.
That's pretty special.
It is, yes.
Like that a lot. William, go ahead and give a shout out for your backdrop, website and all of that kind of thing. Yeah. And let people know what else you do.
No problem. So this is the link.
Like Dragonsbane and stuff.
Yes. I have a full fantasy series that I have written over the past 32 years called The Chronicles of the Dragonsbane. Incorporates my love for history, mythology, folklore, and literature, and is actually the story and tale of Excalibur before the legend of King Arthur. And also I have 5 books on Titanic, including one of my personal prize pieces, which is Titanic: The Legacy Remains, where I actually interviewed a number of the descendants as well as members of the expedition's dive team, and just to not only ask about questions such as why are we fascinated by a century-old disaster, but also in the hopes to inspire the next generation of explorers. How do you get into doing exploration and piloting a submersible and things to that effect?
P.S. Give a shout out for the August event for
Yes.
Titanic, the
Conference.
convention.
Yes, shout out for Bill Willard and his Titanic conference. Going to be a huge event this year.
And my wife and I will both be there, by the way.
Oh, excellent. So looks like we'll be having that drink sooner than expected.
All right. All right. I got something really cool in the mail that I didn't expect was going to come like today, but it's pretty cool. And I got to make sure I get the name right and all of that. I did an interview with Carl J. Grasso a few days ago, which is going to be airing Friday night at 6 p.m. on Tingler Television, the Roku channel. Yeah. And, some Mutilator 2.
Nice.
It's so freaking cool. Brand new. I love it. Oh, and it's got a interesting saying on the back.
Oh, I like that.
And yeah, from this morning's events and all of that kind of thing. And, not for everybody. But Mutilator 2, let me tell you, if you liked the first one, you are going to absolutely fall over with the second one. And please go to Tingler Television, 6 p.m. Friday night, and you will see a 2-hour interview with Carl J. Grasso, and we'll get all of the inside dibs on Mutilator 2, which he is in, and he's very excited about being in. Thank you so much, first of all, for that. And then I want to talk directly to our audience. You guys are amazing. You guys are just an inspiration for us at Tingler Television, especially at Zombie Palooza Radio Live, and we adore you, absolutely. So please, if you're interested in, putting your tippity-tappity and going over to our Facebook page, Zombie Palooza Radio Live. We also have a YouTube channel, Zombie Palooza Radio Live, and we are absolutely thrilled that this interview went splendidly well, better than I even expected. Thank you so much to our guest and our co-host. This is Jackie Chin, and you have been watching
Dum dum dum.
Zombie Palooza Radio Live. Good night, folks.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks again, Jackie.